Dear colleagues, good afternoon and welcome to this event. My name is Etienne Azin and I'm a researcher at CIRAD and pretty much involved in the transformative platform, partnership platform, the TPP, a platform that has been jointly set up by C4ECRAF and the French research organization, and open to wider partnerships to tackle two things: knowledge gaps and implementation gaps in agroecological transition of agriculture and food systems. As you know, this transition is an essential element of the climate equation. I will have the pleasure to moderate this event entitled Actioning Agroecological Conducing Policy for a Food System Transformation in the GLF Climate Hybrid Conference in Glasgow. Policy are indeed a very strong parameter of the implementation of agroecological transition. And the TPP has developed a methodological framework to assess policies in this domain so that the policymakers and the political actors are more informed, more equipped about the steps they must take to lead food system transformations. These virtual events will have three short presentations before the interaction with the audience. First, we will present key findings and discussion of the agroecologically conducive policies, a review that have been made of recent advances and remaining challenges background paper. It will be presented by Frank Place, Director of CGIAR Research Program on Policy, Institutions and Market, PIM, and Paolo Niederli, Professor of Agro-Food Studies and Economic Sociology, of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. Both are working in the policy domain of transformation, the transformative partnership platform of agroecology, TPP. The second part will be the presentation of the value of a non-consensual process in the joint work on agriculture and climate change, illustrated by the Coronivia process that focus on the linkage between agriculture and climate change policies and how to build up an international agreement about these policies. The presentation will focus on the added value of the agroecological coalition, a coalition of the willing rather than required consensus, that it shows the way on how to go beyond the antagonistic view on agroecological approaches. It will be presented by Fergus Sinclair, Chief Scientist at C4ECRAF and co-convener of the TPP. And the last presentation will be more about the civil society perspective on these policies, on concrete experiences from Peru, and the constraints farmers face in taking up agroecological transition. It will be presented by Maria Claudia Valdivia. She is an agriculture thematic lead at the Practical Action Peru. It's an NGO in Peru, and she is a specialist in forestry and natural resources linked to climate change. So with that, I will give the floor to Frank for these three presentations, Frank and Paolo for the first, and then we have some time for interaction with the audience. You have the floor, Frank.
Thank you very much, Etienne. We can have the presentation then up. Anyway, maybe while it's coming up, the paper is called Agroecologically Conducive Policies, a review of recent advances and remaining challenges. And the rationale for this paper is several. Next slide, please. As many of you know, that there's increasing agreement on the need for food system reforms which are in line with the principles of agroecology, especially more sustainable agriculture and food systems, healthier and more nutritious foods. There's momentum building at global, national, local levels for reforms in support of agroecology principles across different farming systems, from more industrialized and less industrialized, and from countries with different levels of agricultural transformation. There has been a lot of progress on the identification of needs for wider scale adoption of agroecology, but a lack of discussion of precise policy measures and actions that can be taken. And thus the purpose of the paper was to provide a review of recent advances in policy developments that might be conducive to agroecological transitions and associated challenges to their implementation. Next slide, please. So the methodology, we set out to identify the types of specific policy measures that can have a significant effect on the application of agroecology, the 10 agroecological principles, and to provide examples of actual policy measures in practice by regional, national, or local governments, sometimes city governments, for example. It also aimed to review the success of these policy measures, but in fact, we found little available evidence for that part of the paper, as many of the policy measures undertaken for agroecology transitions are relatively new. We found very useful the FAO Food and Agriculture Policy Decision Analysis Framework, and we adapted it to include elements of the FAO High-Level Panel of Expert Food System Framework as well. I'll talk about that on the next slide. We also used a lot of expert knowledge. Actually, all the co-authors are very knowledgeable in this, and we reached out to others. And the FAO Agroecology Lex database was very valuable in identifying very promising and innovative policies, and we reviewed the literature as well. And we made an initial presentation of a draft paper back in July. We invited comments on this between August and October, and those were received, and we're just in the process of finalizing the paper. So we expect in a couple of weeks it will be more widely available, and we'll circulate that link to everyone. Next slide, please. Yeah, as I was talking about this analytical framework, so the FAO Agriculture Policy Decision Analysis Framework included policies under the broad thematic areas of producer, consumer, and macro trade. And while that's a very good start, we know that the food system is a bit broader than that. And so we wanted to bring in the aspects of the markets and food environment oriented policies, because you can drive food systems not only from producer and consumer level or broader policies, but also getting into, say, the midstream of the food value chains and so forth. So we wanted to integrate that in and look at policies that were aimed at that group of actors, and also included a cross-cutting category, sort of to accommodate different policies or investments made in areas such as research. You know, in general, to really foster a transition, you need to have policies working across all of those different domains, you know, in an integrated way. So we wanted to make sure we covered that broad spectrum. And then within each thematic area, we looked at the different types of policy measures. And this also came from the FAO framework to look at taxes, subsidies, control measures, information campaigns, et cetera, a whole range of things. So next slide, please. So the high level findings were that, first of all, a few countries have put forward policies or strategies that specifically and explicitly aim to foster wider practice of multiple agroecology principles. And here's some examples: France, Brazil, Nicaragua. Many more countries beyond those have enacted policies that may not explicitly mention agroecology, yet they align closely with one or more of the principles. So we wanted to also bring in examples of those policies. We found also that the comprehensive, that is like the integration of policies across different domains and sustained follow through of policies enacted, has proved to be a challenge in agroecology in many instances, due partly sometimes to changes of government and priorities, lack of understanding of how to implement these to be effective, political challenges. We have different vested interests, for example. So those are a range of things, and Paulo might talk a little bit more about that later when I hand it over to him. And of course, at the same time, while these new policies are being enacted and being implemented, we still have on the books a lot of other policies that inhibit the practice of agroecology. And some of those are very forceful and strong and with a lot of investment behind them. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through 3 slides, but I'm not going to go through the details, but feel free to just, review this. But the first column on the left just talks about different types of policies. The middle column gives you a little bit more information of some examples of those specific measures under those types. And then the last column on the right are concrete examples of what's been enacted by different government levels, sometimes regions, sometimes countries, sometimes local levels. So for instance, on consumer-oriented policies, taxes and subsidies have been implemented in many cases, and we have, to put higher taxes on highly processed foods, for example, or induce and have some subsidies on healthier foods. And so some examples are there on the right-hand side. Nutritional and health assistance, there's a lot of work on developing information campaigns to raise awareness of healthy foods, supporting the use of labels on retail products so that it helps consumers to select the most nutritious foods. And here's some examples on the right. We have some strategies, documents, but also some specific policies like Chile's food labeling and advertising law. Next slide, please. On producer-oriented policies, there's quite a rich array of policy measures that have been enacted. So there's one policy area is on production support, and another one is on more on natural resource management oriented policies. And there's a few more categories I've left off, the same with consumer oriented ones for the sake of time for this presentation. But on production support, we have policies oriented around trying to reduce the input subsidies that favor the use of chemicals and the production of less nutritious crops, pesticide reduction, the training of public extension officers and agroecology principles, and so on. So those are some examples of measures that can be undertaken. And then on the right-hand side column, here's some examples of things that have been enacted in place. So at the country level, we have some interesting cases from Mexico on the elimination of harmful chemicals. Nicaragua has established technical mandatory standards that to assist farmers with agroecology. At the level of the region of the EU, they have a couple of very ambitious new strategies, the farm to fork and biodiversity strategy that also has explicit targets there. Natural resource management, there's also a variety of programs in place, some to help support the improvement of soil health and biodiversity, improving the security of tenure, which is one of the principles for smallholder farmers. And again, we give a couple examples there in the right-hand column. Next slide, please. And then finally, on market and food environment oriented policies, this is my last one on examples of policies. We have where the government can become directly involved in market participation, where they can help to regulate market actors and they can try to catalyze new markets. So for example, direct market participation is when the government may become involved in procurement of foods, and they can orient these around agroecologically produced foods, for example, in school feeding programs and so forth. There's also in regulation of markets as to help establish food safety regulations, create standards and labeling throughout the value chain. That's not only for retailers, but also for wholesalers and retailers to know what they're getting from their sources as well. And there's some examples there on the right-hand side. And catalyzing new markets to develop markets for agroecology produced products on the one hand, but also to catalyze the production of organic nutrient inputs as an alternative method for getting nutrients into the agriculture systems, for example. So here's some, and then also on payments for environmental services. So next slide, and this is going to be my last one, and then I'll turn it over to Paulo. So a key question is though, well, how effective are these policies? And you'll notice that many are new. And so as I said at the beginning, there hasn't been a lot of study about the effectiveness of all of these. There have been a little bit on the nutritional labeling policies, but not so many others. So we look back at several studies related to environmental policies that were done before. But one thing I did want to mention amongst these policies that I mentioned before, these measures, they could be also grouped as persuasion and sensitization type policies as one group. Another is to incentivize behavioral change through taxes and subsidies, and another is command and control through regulations, for example. Prior studies on the effectiveness of policies on environmental outcomes find that behavioral change and outcomes are generally more affected through the command and control, though the ability to monitor and enforce is a very important aspect of that to work, and those are often challenging. But as I said, there's still a major gap in this area, so there's a lot more attention that needs to be done. With that, next slide and over to Paulo.
Thanks, Frank. I have just a few additional comments to your presentation. In this first effort to analyze the policy supporting agroecological transition processes, in addition to identifying different categories of policies, two aspects catch our attention. So the first aspect is associated with the predominance of a logic that recognizing the multidimensionality of agroecology works to embed it in all policies instead of bet all chips in a single unified program. What I mean is that there is an increasing understanding that it's not enough to create a program or a policy supporting agroecological transition if all other programs continue to be aimed at supporting unsustainable food systems. Today, there is a sort of consensus on the importance of integrating food policies. We are all discussing food policy, integrated food policies. However, very little is known about what actually needs to be integrated. What policies, where to start, do all instruments necessarily have to work in an integrated way? What does that mean, in fact, to integrate public policies? And finally, how to integrate national policies that need at the same time to be flexible to fit different local conditions. In other words, the policy integration also involves multi-scale dynamics. So next slide, please. The second aspect catching our attention concerns the implementation processes and the adaptation of policy instruments to different social and ecological contexts. So it obliges us to go beyond not only isolated policies, but also the formal aspects of their formulation to understand dimensions related to coherence, coordination, governance, all dimensions that become central to the assessment of policy outcomes. So during implementation, we have seen that street-level bureaucrats, they are always adapting instruments according to their own interpretation of the public problems, what generates unintended effects that policies analysis and assessment often pays little attention to. So next slide, please, and the last one. So to conclude, this initial effort we have done of analysis have shown that as a set of principles, agroecology has offered different routes of transition to sustainable and healthy agri-food systems. As Frank has told, until now, only a few countries have made this move to design a broad and integrated set of public policies supporting agroecological transitions. But several countries have already put in place significant policy measures in support of such transitions that address directly or sometimes indirectly one or more of the agroecological principles. The problem is that up to now we have seen only a few, yet very, very inspiring localized studies about the effectiveness of the policies. And besides, most of the studies focus only in those countries and territories where agroecology is seen as an alternative to industrial food systems. What we are also trying to do in this study is to understand how policies supporting agroecological transitions also are developed and contribute to in those contexts where changing from this industrial food system is not the main issue. What I mean is that also in countries, territories, landscapes where industrial agriculture or industrial foods, agri-food systems are not predominant, we need to discuss what kind of public policies supporting agroecological transitions is needed. Thank you. This is my few comments complementary to Frank's presentation.
Thank you very much, Paolo and Frank, for these tools to decipher the complex topology of policies in agroecology. We'll come back in the question and the interaction with the audience on this, because I guess that the background paper is much richer than the few lessons you presented. Okay, with that, I would like to pass the floor to Fergus to present this Coronivia process and the coalition looking for action.
So we're joining you from Glasgow, where the COP26 is happening, and it's very interesting because the coalition to transform food systems through agroecology, which emerged from the United Nations Food Systems Summit, had all of the agriculture ministers and negotiators involved. Whereas here at UNFCCC, it's predominantly the environment ministries that are here and negotiating and so on. And this shows the huge divide and the difficulty of integration, because the agricultural process, which we're going to hear a little bit about in a moment in a video, is called the Coronivia joint work. And it's trying to look at how agriculture can be worked into climate negotiations and action. And we can see immediately this disconnect between agriculture and environment. Let's look at this video, and then I'll say a few words after it in terms of where the coalition from UNFS is going and how we can bring things together. The video, please.
Climate change and agriculture are inextricably linked. On one hand, climate change threatens agriculture, food security, and the livelihoods of those who depend on it. But at the same time, it is estimated that our food systems could be responsible for a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. Established under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2017, Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture officially acknowledges the unique role that agriculture can play in tackling climate change. This work has brought UNFCCC parties from around the world together to discuss a number of areas related to agriculture, climate change, and food security. As we approach the end of the Coronivia Roadmap, a report on the outcomes of this work is due to be presented at the United Nations Climate Change Conference. Although it is difficult to predict the outcomes of Coronivia discussions, it is possible to identify 5 categories that could offer various combinations or pathways for action. Parties could identify technical priorities of work where there is consensus, or they could determine institutional modalities for their implementation under the Convention. They could extend the roadmap to discuss present or new topics, recognize the work performed so far, or Coronivia joint work on agriculture could remain dormant with no agreement reached. Not all these possibilities demonstrate the same level of ambition or effort. Coronivia will only be a true success once all these dimensions are addressed and concrete action is taken. Achieving a more sustainable, resilient, and food-secure agriculture in the face of a worsening climate crisis will take time. However, the end of the Coronivia Roadmap provides a unique opportunity to take an important step towards meaningful change.
Sorry, just had to unmute the element from here. So what is happening is that these negotiations on Coronivia are actually extremely difficult at the moment. So I was hearing yesterday that they resumed the negotiations at 9 o'clock in the evening because they were having difficulty in coming to agreement. And these consensual processes within the United Nations are extremely difficult to end up with decisions that have a lot of substance and decisions that are integrated across food systems and environment, because it's extremely difficult to get that sort of agreement across so many countries. And it's actually the youth sector within these negotiations that are really pushing for agroecology. There are some countries that are not so keen to have that on board. Now, that makes coalitions of the willing, that's countries that actually do want to go ahead, much more powerful in taking action than having to get everybody to agree. And so the coalition coming out of the United Nations Food Systems Summit, which has 27 countries signed up to it, 35 organizations, including 5 of the UN organizations, is, we think, possibly a way of making faster progress with those countries that are prepared to take things forward. And we'll be looking at that further in a session between 6 and 7 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time in the plenary session for this Global Landscapes Forum on the sidelines of COP26. Thank you. Over to...
Thank you, Fergus. Thank you, Fergus, very much. And we'll come back to that. I would like to pass the floor to Maria Claudia Valvidia now to speak about the civil society perspective about this very complex equation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm Maria Claudia Valdivia. I am the Green Business Lead in Practical Action. So we have been working in Peru for over 30 years. And I really want to share what I have seen, but mostly what I have learned talking with different farmers. So in ways, so they have been telling me how agroecology is really necessary, but how difficult it is to actually transition because they don't have really the ways to do so, to actually adapt to a more resilient farming system. I have been working mostly with agroforestry. We have a program that goes for over 20 years in practical action. You see, coffee is one of the most important commodities in Peru, but also is one of the drivers of deforestation. And in Peru, the agriculture and the forestry sector has is the most emitter CO2 sector in Peru. So we have been working towards it for years in Peru, but it's mainly pushed for the Ministry of Environment. We have agroforestry. Our forestry and wildlife law had already included agroforestry since 2011. In 2015, we got these 4 regulations that came from this law and one of them was mainly talking about how to implement agroforestry as a sustainable way to transition from a traditional coffee farming to a more sustainable one, which involved this agroecology fundamental within the regulation. So it was really a big step for Peru to change towards the transitions, but it has been 10 years after the law and 6 years since the regulations, and there hasn't been really any significant changes towards the transitions. There are more these islands of change that have happened, working, of course, with the local government, but all these stakeholders, especially civil society, as Practical Action and CIPRAF, and other organizations that have been working towards this change, but we can achieve this change and this transformational change we want all by ourselves. We are making these islands of change mainly when the public government has tried to push agroforestry as well with public programs. We have found that they mainly focus on putting the technology out there. They construct nurseries of plant trees for them to plant in the field. They start giving subsidies to organic fertilizers. But what you see in the farms is that trees that are mainly in the yard of the farmers. You see forest that has been deforested for these trees to be planted instead of including this into the agroforestry system itself. So what we have seen is most of these programs, most of these programs have failed is because farmers are not in a leading position in the decision-making process. We need not only to give them the technology, we as practitioners, as the government, as the private sector need to work to put, of course, into action all these policies that have been coming up over the past few years, but we also need to put farmers in a really decision-making position, and this is where locally adaptation, community-based adaptation comes in as well. We have seen how farmers that are not only given the technical capacities for them to implement agroforestry, but also when you give them these adaptive capacities that include negotiation skills, that include this linking to the market, these other really necessary skill for them to make choices after the project is ended is the way to go through and to transition in a sustainable manner and keep the impact beyond the project, beyond the program, after and discontinue after the actions we as at the private sector, but also as the government sector do. This is a way to go and to actually make the change. This is what we have seen in the field. In Peru, I know I have been talking only about one commodity, but this is something that also happened in other value chains. Well, before, I think the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Environment were really working in separate directions. I think it has been mentioned too, it has been mentioned in the presentation, Fred was also mentioned that this law I have been talking about was pushed mainly by the environmental sector, and the Ministry of Agriculture was pushing somewhere else. This is also one of the enabling conditions we need to work through. I think in Peru, we are moving towards this direction. This year, the Ministry of Agriculture changed the name to also include agroecology in the picture. We moved towards just a Ministry of Agriculture to a Ministry of Agrarian Development and Irrigation. And one of the directions within this new name ministry is actually a direction of agriculture and agroecology. So we have been pushing all of this. I think we still need, of course, a lot of work to do. In this COP, we have around 20 delegates, only one is from the Ministry of Agriculture, and it's not of this direction I'm talking about, it's from the climate change, who really works more with the Ministry of Environment that with developing these agroecology policies itself. So we need to keep moving forward and working together, but I think it's a really good start what we are doing in Peru, but to actually make the change it's the farmers who need to make a change to actually transform the way agriculture works. So they need to be in these leading positions. At a community level, we need to keep working towards building this adaptive capacity. At a global level, we need to work within these policies, but NDCs and these policies aren't the recipe for change. We also need to work within communities and putting all these locally led strategies that let farmer actually appropriate the technology and work or move forward the project we are trying to implement and the changes we as civil society, we as a government can make. And I think at a local level, we need to have a more joint work between all these different agencies we have to actually, as it was mentioned before, it's not about having a policy as we did with agroforestry to push agroforestry forward. We need to have all this embedded in our policies. We have started doing so, I think, but we need to keep working towards that. So yeah, I think it's really important. All these decisions, all these agreements are the tipping point for us to actually make the change, but farmers need to be also put into a leading position in order to achieve the change we want to see.
Thank you very much, Maria Claudia. This is a striking illustration of the real absence of agriculture in this climate negotiation and the importance of taking the farmers into the equation from the start at the local level. I have a question from the audience that illustrates really well the complexity of how you deal with trade-offs and different conflicting vested interests. From the Costa Rica, so the question is, somebody working in ecological restoration in Costa Rica, how can we transition to agroecology in countries like Costa Rica, where pineapple and banana, as example, monocultures, are so extended that they endanger all our ecosystem and therefore people's health? The government gives so many opportunities to put those monoculture, and we do have more problems and requirements if we want to implement agroecological process. So I would ask to direct these questions to Paolo and Frank about their study, their overview about policy. Do you that gives back the focus on local situation instead of the difficulty to gather a global coalition making agreements? But do you have examples of policy that managed to overcome these conflicted vested interests? Frank and Paolo, maybe.
Yeah, maybe I'll say a few words and Paulo can come in. I mean, it's a very difficult challenge. You know, we always say we want to have more inclusive policy dialogues and development of policies, but yet the voice of different stakeholders is often not heard in when it comes to making policy decisions. And so obviously in the longer term, we need more engagement of different stakeholders in the policy dialogue process. There's some governments that I've seen some successes more at the local level where there's a little bit more accountability at the local level for different investments and priorities. For example, in Uganda, they have a nice baraza system. At the national level, it's a little bit more difficult, and I'd have to think about that more, whether there's some good examples. But certainly, I think we need to, again, also do a bit more on providing evidence that a transition from that model will actually also produce a lot of benefits. I think politicians perhaps are rightly worried that if they go away from those sectors, they're going to lose jobs, they're going to lose revenues, et cetera. So we have to provide the evidence that no, even at scale, alternative systems can provide some of those things. And I think that's what we're aiming to try to do. That's all I'll say there. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. Paulo?
Very quickly, because we have seen the same problem here in Brazil, where we had this national program supporting agroecology, but most of the public budget were supporting the expansion of soy production. And it was putting all territories and agroecological initiatives in danger. And of course, it's very important to reorganize the rural development strategy in order to block the advance of these monocultures and in territories or landscapes where agroecology and indigenous communities, family farming and peasants are still very strong. And at the same time, we had to think how the international market dynamics can be a turning point in this dynamic, because when we're talking about these commodities, bananas, soybeans, and many others, we have to consider what is going on in international scale too.
Thank you, Paulo. So you show again that the transformation is going to be a fight. I would like to complete this question about the power struggle between different vested interests, about the principle of equity. It's clear in agroecology that this principle is difficult to implement, and specifically in policy. But the ESDG mentioned really clearly that stakeholders comes before shareholders, and poverty reduction is a key beacon for policy. So in your experience, and I would extend the questions to also Maria Claudia and Fergus, in your experience, these principles of equity, fighting for the poor, does appear in some policy and some decision to just specifically to reduce the trade-off of policies. Wants to speak? Maybe Maria Claudia, do you think that you will be able to convince governments, maybe at different scales of governments in Peru, about these principles of equity?
Well, I think it's really hard when especially when all these commodities and agriculture really look into a more private driven or business driven models. So I think farmers and all this inequity that you can find within this sector is something that it's not really taken into account. It's really difficult. Improve all this. We are working towards this. We are talking about inclusion. We are talking about rural farmers and how they can be involved. It's something that is already on the table, but it's really hard when everybody's not in the same page about that. So not everybody thinking about this when doing business. So yes, I think what these spaces is actually the results of this discussion and this agreement is actually what can lead to the market, and all these different stakeholders are part of these value chains that need to be sustainable to actually drive in the same direction. So we can think about putting, as I have said, putting the farmers also in the picture and reduce all the vulnerability they have as farmers, as women, as young people. And yes, looking into this, I think it's difficult, it's a challenge, it's not easy. Not everybody has this in mind when talking about sustainable farming. Some people are just mainly focused on the crop, on the product, but not on the people behind the product. So yes, I think it has changed, but yes, we need to keep on working on that.
Okay, so in a way, you reinforce what Frank said about documenting the social and not only the income and jobs, but also the social interest of agroecology in the transformation to be able to feed better the policy. Is that right, Frank?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
We need to work in the socioeconomic.
I'll just add one short thing on that too. I think it's again a question of integration, because I think you have to embed that philosophy across your different government sectors and so forth. So it's not really a high priority. I don't see that in agriculture. Agriculture is about productivity, production, and that kind of equity is left to the more the human services where you have social protection programs. But in fact, we need to embed it across the portfolio. Yeah.
Can I just add? I think it's actually equity of agency.
Yeah.
Of actors throughout food systems that we really need to focus on, consumers as well as producers. And it's only when everybody is able to express their preferences for more sustainably and equitably produced food that we're going to get there. And, we do need to be realistic about equity, because equity is just about any set of principles. If you look at adaptation principles, you'll find equity there. The agroecological principles, equity is there. But when we actually look at what's practiced, I mean, look here in COP26, look at the vaccine issue. You've got countries where everybody's virtually vaccinated, and we've got other countries where nobody is. So at the same time as people come to Glasgow to talk about equity, it's absolutely clear that a lot of people are not here because of the vaccine regimes in the countries that they come from. So it's obviously something that everybody thinks is a wonderful idea, but it doesn't seem to actually get acted upon very much because of the vested interests that stop it.
Yeah.
And so we really need to work at how the mechanisms for people to actually be able to express their preferences can happen. A democratization, if you like, of food systems. Thanks.
Frank?
Yep.
You want to add something?
Okay.
Yeah, you're an economist, but I'm not an economist. But what I see is that 10 years ago, inequality was a bad word for economists. Now, for economists, inequality is a reality that have to be fight for the sake of the economy. So I think there is hope that at some point we'll be able to translate equity, agency into economical concept and political concept that could feed the political decision.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you think about that. It might be a dream, but it's not only a motto that we can just serve as an alibi. It has to be embedded in concept, concrete concept to build up a policy and to arbitrate, to make a judgment about trade-offs.
Yep.
Any addition to that before we close this nice event?
Only just comment, because I want to I agree with Maria when she says that we'll not have equity without participation. So all councils, all the spaces of collective production of public policies need to be rebuilt, reconstructed. And this is the way to find equity and engage in farmers and all other actors.
Great wrapping words. Participation is the key word. Okay, with that, I would really like to thank warmly our 4 presenters and the audience for this event. In a few weeks from now, you'll be able to see the last version of this background paper, and probably also the recording of this event. So with that, I would like to close this event and thank everybody for this participation.
Thank you, everyone.